This is the instructor's overview. This is the instructor's overview for Chapter 24, the Second World War. This chapter begins with a discussion of the rise of fascism abroad and how and why fighting broke out in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. The three primary countries that were allied as the Axis powers were Germany, Italy, and Japan. So the World War II was fought then in three theaters. Germany was looking to expand west and east, while Italy was looking to expand south into North Africa. So two of the theaters were Europe and North Africa. And in this political cartoon, we can see the idea that Hitler was hoping to expand all over the globe. The third theater was in the Pacific. Japan was an expansionist nation that had attacked China and was conquering parts of French Indochina and the islands in the Pacific. And here we can see at the height of the war how far Germany had expanded and conquered, or how far, the Axis powers had expanded and conquered. Next, the chapter follows through on how the United States became involved in the fighting. And this was a long, slow process. The United States was bitter after World War I and isolationist and reluctant to enter into a war in Europe. So here we can see in this political cartoon Franklin Roosevelt here in the middle holding his binoculars, sitting in a grandstand of neutrality. And the cartoonist is trying to show that it's naive to think that the United States can just sit there as a neutral nation and not get dragged into this country. Into this war, And indeed, that's what happened with Pearl Harbor. The bombing at Pearl Harbor pulled the United States into war with Japan, and once the U.S. declared war on Japan, their allies, Japan's allies, Germany and Italy, then declared war on the United States. So the U.S. was then drawn into the three theaters of war. So the nation then mobilized for war again by transitioning the industrial economy to wartime production. They created an astounding amount of industrial goods for the war, and they engaged women and minorities in the wartime production. So the textbook talks about the role of women in the workforce, and in this image we can see female aircraft workers in LA. Many of the aircraft that were used to fight the war were built in Los Angeles, and women did a lot of the construction of those airplanes. About 40% of the workforce in aircraft production in Los Angeles were women. The war also led to some Americans rethinking ideas about race in America. The United States was fighting against the rhetoric of racism of the Nazis, and it naturally brought some Americans to think about a hypocrisy of racism at home while fighting it abroad. So in some ways, World War II had some of the biggest seeds for the civil rights movement that would soon be emerging in the 1950s. Racial tensions were seen in race rioting, like in this image in Detroit. And here's another race riot in Detroit. The rioting was with African Americans. In the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles, rioting was against Mexican American youth. And then finally we see racial tensions as well in the internment of the Japanese. The internment of the Japanese was ordered by the president. The Japanese and Japanese Americans, in fact, nearly half of the people who were interned were American citizens. They were rounded up and arrested and incarcerated in camps. Now, internment is a nice word to describe what, in essence, was incarceration. So, Japanese families lived in these bunkers here, and their communities, the camps, were surrounded by barbed wire and fences and guard towers. If they had tried to leave, they would have been shot and killed. So they were imprisoned for a significant portion of the war until the Supreme Court rightly declared them unconstitutional. The textbook then talks about the wartime strategies and fighting and focuses on the war of the United States in helping to defeat the Nazis. And towards the end of the chapter, the textbook focuses on some of the major battles and actions that were taken to end the war in Europe and the war in the Pacific. So in this map, we can see the Normandy invasion, and then also this big purple arrow, the bombings of Germany. So on the west, we have the British and the Americans coming in, and then from the east, the Soviets were pushing in, squeezing Germany from the west and the east. And of course, in the Pacific, the war is ended with the dropping of the atomic bomb. So the chapter concludes with the chapter concludes with an explanation of the impact of the war on the United States and on the fighting. So when the United States enters into the war, as you can see in these charts, many more tonnage of bombs are dropped, more personnel are dropped into the war. The United States purchases and produces far more than it had before the war. And all of that industrial production not only helped the Allies win the war, but it also pulled the economy out of the Depression. And unemployment fell to almost zero during the war. In fact, in many places, there were shortages of workers. This is an image from Hiroshima after the bombing in 1945. In an effort to end the war, the United States dropped the atomic bomb. And then 3 days later, it dropped another bomb on Nagasaki. And this, of course, does end the war in the Pacific. So with the outcome of the war, World War II ended American isolationism, and the United States became actively engaged abroad, with one of its primary goals being to ensure international stability. It brought prosperity back to the country. Big businesses grew much bigger. New technologies were invented, weapons technologies, but also new radar and sonar, chemicals, plastics. It spurred the civil rights movement, it encouraged a women's movement, and the U.S. emerged as one of the world's biggest superpower, if not the largest superpower. And it also sets in motion a Cold War that is talked about in the next chapter. So thank you for listening.